Every drunk wakes up eventually, not to clarity at first, to something worse, the cold, disoriented moment before the mind catches up with the body. The body always knows first. At the end of Isaiah 28, we watched the leadership of ancient Jerusalem, and by extension, the modern architects of a security paradigm, staggering. Intoxicated by a flawed doctrine that assumed a threat could be managed indefinitely. A refuge of lies, a covenant made with death, signed on the belief that the gate could be held with economic incentives, high-tech walls, and the slow game of normalization. We left that chapter standing on a tried stone. A foundation laid in Zion, precious, sure. A bedrock built to survive an overflowing scourge. If chapter 28 named the wine that made a nation drunk and blind to the threat at the gate, chapter 29 is the chapter of Ari-El, the chapter of the lion. It carries the same terrifying register as Jeremiah's later words, "The Lord shall roar from above, and from his holy habitation he shall give forth his voice, he shall roar over his habitation." What follows reads with extraordinary immediacy after the 7th of October in the year 2023, on Simchat Torah, the day the annual cycle of Torah reading completes and begins again. A regional war on multiple fronts, hostages whispering from beneath the ground, the sudden, unannounced collapse of terror leadership, and the painful, necessary awakening of a people forced to reckon with what peace can and cannot be negotiated with. Isaiah 29 is not, in the end, a chapter of unanswered siege. It is a chapter of victory, but not the kind that gloats. The lion that seems brought low under siege at its opening rises fully awake by its close. Enemies scattered like chaff, command networks broken in an instant, truth-tellers vindicated, and a nation standing sober and unashamed on the tried stone of Zion. Whatever ground this chapter walks through, it walks through upright. Let's begin, verse by verse. Our first verse.
Woe to Ari-El, the city where David encamped. Add year to year, let the festivals run their round.
Ari-El is Jerusalem. Look closely at the name and you find it doubled, a Hebrew repetition that gives the name emphasis and weight. The name itself has long invited the hearing, Ari-El. Ari, lion, strength, courage, the vigor of a nation that can defend itself, and El, God, the holiness of an altar, the presence that gives strength its meaning. Ari-El, the lion of God. But the same word carries a second, harder meaning underneath it, altar hearth, the place where sacrifices are burned. This is the same city whose priest and prophet we watched staggering drunk 2 chapters ago. Because leadership separated national strength from covenantal foundation, relying on a temporary encampment of high-tech barriers rather than dwelling securely in truth, the lion is reduced, for a time, to an altar of sacrifice. Where David encamped, not built, not established. Encamped, a soldier's word, a military word, and the word reaches forward as much as it reaches back. The city named for one king's encampment will, in this very chapter, become the ground where a nation is encamped and fighting again. Surrounded on every side, forced once more to hold Jerusalem the way a soldier holds a camp rather than the way a settled people rests in a home. A camp can be struck. In the verses ahead, it is. And then a phrase of quiet, modern wait. Add year to year, let the festivals run their round. Before October 7th, the assumption was that the calendar would simply keep turning. The economy would grow, the threat would stay managed, the routine would continue. It did not continue. The festival cycle was shattered mid-festival, on the very day appointed for completion and renewal. And for those held beneath the ground, Festival after festival came and went without them. Passover, then Shavuot, then Rosh Hashanah, then Sukkot. Each one no longer a return to routine, but a fresh reckoning. Our second verse,
Yet I will distress Ari-El, and there shall be mourning and lamentation, and she shall be unto me as Ari-El.
listen to what the verse does with its name. Ari-El becomes Ari-El. This is the double meaning from verse 1, closing its circle. The city under distress becomes the altar hearth. But in the arc of this chapter, the altar hearth will become the lion again. The suffering and the strength are named with the exact same word because they are not two separate movements. One becomes the other. The distress named here does not arrive as a single blow. It converges from multiple directions at once, which is precisely what unfolded in the months following October 7th. 7 fronts, roughly speaking, ignited at once. Gaza to the southwest, Hezbollah in Lebanon to the north, Syria to the northeast, a corridor for weapons and militias, Iraq to the east, a source of drone and missile fire, the Houthis in Yemen to the south, threatening maritime routes, Judea and Samaria, an internal front along the country's narrow waist, and Iran at the center, coordinating and funding the network around it. The siege is no longer a symbol, it is an operational map. Verse 3 expands the perimeter.
And I will encamp around you, and I will besiege you with a siege position, and I will raise siege works against you.
Notice who is speaking. Isaiah attributes the siege ultimately to God, even where human armies are its instruments. I will encamp, I will besiege. God ordains it, the enemy executes it. This is not a circle of Israel's own making, and the siege works named here are not Israel's defenses. This is the enemy's own encirclement, the rocket arsenals, the tunnel networks, the missile stockpiles raised by Hezbollah, Hamas and Iran, positioned on every side and aimed inward at Jerusalem. The siege is theirs. What the verse describes is a city surrounded by hostile fortifications closing in from every direction at once. Not a canopy raised in her defense, but a wall of offense raised against her. Then verse 4 delivers a heavier, haunting image.
And you shall be brought down, and shall speak out of the ground, and your speech shall be low out of the dust, and your voice shall be as of one that has a familiar spirit out of the ground, and your speech shall whisper out of the dust.
Isaiah describes here a state of total subjugation, humiliation so complete that speech itself is pictured coming up out of the ground, low and faint. Listen to the Hebrew phrasing closely, and it evokes something more specific than distant lament. It evokes a muffled, ghostly whisper rising from the dirt itself. We hear this today, and the image turns unexpectedly literal. We hear the subterranean tunnels of Gaza. We hear the profound isolation of the hostages, stripped of autonomy, cut off from the light of the surface world, their voices reduced to muffled whispers in the dust. The text offers a sacred ancient lens through which to process an agonizing modern pain. It is an old verse. The grief it describes is not old. But Isaiah does not leave the nation in the dust. In verses 5 through 8, the pacing of the prophecy snaps. Verse 5,
But the multitude of your strangers shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the ruthless ones as chaff that passes away, and it shall be at an instant, suddenly.
Notice the reversal. In verse 4, Ari-El speaks from the dust. In verse 5, it is Ari-El's enemies who become dust, lefeta pitom, in an instant, suddenly. That is the promise. Verse 6 answers the question it leaves hanging. Suddenly. How? What actually visits a besieging army that collapses like chaff in a single moment? Verse 6.
You shall be visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder, and with earthquake, and great noise, with storm and tempest, and the flame of devouring fire.
Heard through a modern battlefield, the imagery is difficult not to recognize. The concussive shockwave of thunder, the earthquake tearing through bedrock, the devouring flame of secondary explosions in subterranean weapons stores, and it happened suddenly. Not through a slow campaign of attrition, but through specific singular moments. Sinwar, found in Rafah, in an unplanned encounter, not a targeted raid, gone in an instant. Haniyeh, in Tehran, inside a guarded compound, struck down without warning. Nasrallah, in Beirut, years of bunkers, tunnels, command structure, erased in a single strike. And in February of 2026, Khamenei himself. Iran's supreme leader, the man at the very center of the encirclement named in verse 3, struck in Tehran along with his top defense command in a bunker built so deep that his own elevator took minutes just to descend. Depth did not save him either. Each one believed his depth kept him untouchable. Each one was wrong, and each one learned it suddenly. Now the fuller picture, in verses 7 and 8,
And the multitude of all the nations that fight against Ari-El, even all that fight against her and her stronghold, and that distress her, shall be as a dream of a night vision. It shall even be as when a hungry man dreams, and behold, he eats, but he awakes, and his soul is empty, or as when a thirsty man dreams, and behold, he drinks, but he awakes, and behold, he is faint. So shall the multitude of all the nations be that fight against Mount Zion.
Following October 7th, the regional terror axis genuinely believed it had achieved something permanent. The dream was specific: force a dictated ceasefire on its own terms, hold the hostages in the tunnels indefinitely, and use them as a psychological weapon to taunt and dictate terms to Israel in perpetuity. While a person sleeps, a dream feels solid, absolute. It has zero physical substance. The moment the lion wakes, that leverage has no morning in it. These verses extend the image into a double metaphor: the hungry man who tastes food, the thirsty man who feels water on his lips, both waking to find their bodies exactly as empty as before. The hostile coalition believed October 7th was the opening of a feast, that Israel would be dismantled and swallowed whole. They celebrated prematurely, believing the encirclement named in verse 3 had already finished its work. When the sleeper wakes to find the feast was never real, what remains is not triumph on their part, but disorientation. No final conquest, no feast that survives the waking. Verse 9,
Stop and wonder, blind yourselves and be blinded. They are drunk, but not from wine. They stagger, but not from strong drink.
The they continues straight out of the coalition we just left, disoriented. The same multitude still reeling from a feast that was never real, drunk without wine, staggering without drink. Their own certainty has become the thing that undoes them. Verse 10.
For the Lord has poured out upon you a spirit of deep sleep, and has closed your eyes. The prophets and your heads, the seers, has he covered.
But watch where the verse turns next. The blindness it names reaches back into Israel's own house. Notice the tense, has poured out. Not a blindness settling now, but one already in place before that morning. This is the spirit of deep sleep that fell over Israel's own leadership and intelligence establishment in the months before October 7th. Not a lack of information. Israel had satellites, listening posts, informants, more raw intelligence on Gaza than perhaps any military has ever held on an adversary. It was certainty that closed the eyes, the settled belief that Hamas had become a governing party with something to lose. that it wanted the work permits, the reconstruction funds, the quiet rule of Gaza, too much to gamble all of it on an invasion it could not win. The reasoning was not unreasonable. It was simply wrong. Isaiah describes an intelligence failure so profound it feels deliberate. Verse 11.
And the vision of all this has become to you like the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, Read this, I pray you. And he says, I cannot, for it is sealed.
Even the learned among them said, in effect, I cannot, for it is sealed, and meant it more literally than they knew. Israel had captured Hamas's own invasion plan roughly a year in advance. A detailed document later reported under the name Jericho Wall, describing the rocket barrage, the drones meant to blind the border cameras, the paragliders, the breach points. In military protocol, a classified document like that carries an actual seal, a clearance, a chain of authorization required before anyone can act on what it says. In July of that final summer, an analyst matched a live Hamas training exercise to that same plan and carried it to her superiors. She was told it was fantasy. The document existed. The match was made. The book was not hidden. It still had its seal, because no one with the authority to break it chose to. Verse 12.
And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, Read this, I pray you. And he says, I am not learned.
And the same book, delivered a second time, met a different failure. This time it reached someone with the standing to act. A division commander informed that entire Hamas battalions were running drills twice a week, reports that crossed his desk and stopped there. Somewhere in the chain, the answer amounted to the same thing the verse puts in the unlearned man's mouth. Not my reading, not my responsibility, not what I was trained to judge. Verse 13.
The Lord said, Because this people draws near with its mouth and honors me with its lips, while its heart is far from me, and their fear of me has become a human commandment learned through memorization.
Many were religious in form and insincere at heart, devotion that had become a habit performed rather than a truth believed. Verse 14 turns from diagnosis to consequence.
Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder, for the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hidden.
This is Israel's own repentance. The wise men and prudent men named here are Israel's own, the same class we already met in previous chapters, the ones who believed peace with Hamas was possible, who wanted to end the war without getting the hostages back. Wonder upon wonder is what happened. The pager operation against Hezbollah's own network and the precision strikes that reached Hania and Nasrallah in locations they believed were unreachable. Operations other nations' own intelligence services studied afterward with open astonishment, wonder upon wonder, each one more improbable than the last. Verses 15 and 16 continue Isaiah's diagnosis of Judah. But the pattern they describe, power hiding its counsel in darkness, also turns naturally outward in the modern parallel.
Woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in the dark, and they say, Who sees us, and who knows us? Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. For shall the work say of him that made it, He made me not? Or shall the thing framed say of him that framed it, He has no understanding?
We hear this in the regional leadership that proclaims resistance and religious purity in public, while denying, with the same mouth, any share in the narcotics its own faith forbids. Beneath that rhetoric has sat one of the region's largest manufacturing and smuggling networks, its proceeds laundered through the very institutions that claim moral purity. And inside Iran, A regime that derives its authority from religious law has turned that law against its own people. Detentions, extrajudicial violence, subterranean prisons. Behind closed doors, it assumes, no one is watching. Verse 16 names the delusion beneath it. Haf ke kem, your overturning, built on a root that means to turn a thing over, to flip it onto its head. Isaiah is not describing mere hypocrisy here. He is describing an inverted order. Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran have each seated themselves as the potter, and in doing so they have not merely denied the maker, they have replaced him. To insist the framer has no understanding is to manufacture a god in one's own image. Not one who forgives what he sees, but one who simply does not see. A god they haven't hidden from at all, only imagined blind. This is the idolatry of the mind, the clay, blind to the hand that shaped it, insisting the hand is blind as well. Verse 17.
Is it not yet a very little while, and Lebanon shall be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be considered a forest?
In biblical imagery, Lebanon is the cedar forest, dense, wild, imposing. For over 3 decades, southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley were built into precisely that kind of forest: fortified tunnels, hidden mountain silos, deep command bunkers, staging grounds meant to project permanent, untouchable strength. An intimidating wall of cedar and stone holding an entire region hostage to its shadow. A fruitful field is the opposite image: cultivated, ordered, given over to growing things rather than hiding weapons. Stripping away that wild military menace is not an end in itself. It is the prerequisite for what comes next. Isaiah's image points toward a Lebanon known again for what it produces rather than for what is buried beneath it. And the people who lived for decades under that same shadow on both sides of the border might finally have room to breathe. Verse 18,
On that day the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see.
the words of the book here are the Torah. This is the great transformation, a return to God. The people were called deaf and blind, not because their ears and eyes failed them, but because they had not listened to or understood God's own word. On that day, that condition changes. What was sealed becomes understandable. What was refused becomes heard. Verse 19 shifts into the modern context of victory.
The humble also shall increase their joy in the Lord, and the poor among men shall rejoice in the Holy One of Israel.
The humble and the poor here are not an abstraction. They are the quiet, faithful backbone of the nation, the frontline families, the evacuees, the working parents, the young reservists who carried the agonizing weight of the crisis without pretense or political hubris. Read in this modern frame, their multiplied joy belongs to the lifting of that surrounding threat. From here, Isaiah widens the restoration. Blindness gives way to sight, humility to joy, and systems built on intimidation and injustice begin to fall. Verse 20.
For the tyrant shall cease, the scoffer shall be finished, and all those intent upon evil shall be cut off.
Isaiah now names why the people will rejoice. Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, Hassan Nasrallah, Ayatollah Khamenei, men who planned, funded and ordered the killing of innocents, the same men already named in this chapter's sudden reversal. All 4 have been killed. The scoffer is the one who rejects correction. Those at home who wanted peace with Hamas and refused to hear otherwise even after the reasoning behind that hope had already failed. And all those intent upon evil are those set on destroying Israel, the regimes and networks whose stated aim, publicly declared, is the end of the nation itself. And then verse 21 carries this series' quiet through line into its clearest moment yet.
They use words to make people guilty, attack and trap anyone who publicly calls out their wrongdoing, and use false accusations or worthless arguments to defeat innocent people.
This is the soldiers who reported Hamas's activity along the border in the months before October 7th. What happened to their reports in verse 12, dismissed, set aside, treated as someone else's concern, this verse promises will happen no more. Their vindication, still unfolding, is what it points toward. Now the closing of this chapter and the closing of the ark, verses 22 and 23.
Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the house of Jacob, he who redeemed Abraham, Jacob shall no longer be ashamed, and his face shall no longer grow pale. For when he sees his children, the work of my hands in his midst, they shall sanctify my name, they shall sanctify the Holy One of Jacob, and shall stand in awe of the God of Israel.
The paling face sits in parallel with Jacob's shame, humiliation made visible on the face, watching generations of his own descendants fall into idolatry and exile. In the modern application, that same humiliation takes a specific shape, the shock of watching long-held security assumptions collapse, including the belief that economic incentives, quiet management, or land-for-peace concessions with hostile neighbors would guarantee peace. God is introduced as the one who redeemed Abraham in the merit of that same future grandson, and this verse promises that Jacob's shame is permanently ended. When he sees his children, is witnessed as a reborn generation, described explicitly as the work of my hands, who actively return to righteousness and publicly sanctify God's name. In verse 23, seeing children gathered in their midst prophesies the physical ingathering of the exiles. Their survival and return is so mathematically and historically improbable that even worldly observers recognize it as the work of my hands, a direct act of divine providence rather than geopolitical coincidence. The work of my hands applies to the pioneering and defending generations who rebuild the physical land. Even if those children appear secular or non-traditional on the surface, their inner soul essence is crafted directly by God. They execute a divine role in restoring the nation, leading through a crucial sequence. First, the physical gathering and rebuilding in their midst, which then blossoms into spiritual sanctification. And the closing verse, 24.
Those who were mistaken shall gain understanding, and those who complained shall learn instruction.
Those who were mistaken, the to'ei ruach, are the ones driven by confusion, swayed by false concepts or dazed leadership. Their cognitive fog lifts at last into genuine understanding. Those who complained, the Nir-Ganim, the grumblers and skeptics who resented the plain warnings of the realists, stop resisting and begin instead to listen. The verse links directly back to verse 14 and the promise there that the wisdom of the wise men would perish. What perished there is restored here as understanding. In chapter 28, the nation could not stand upright, staggering at its own table, drunk on a wine of false security. The nation that could not stand upright now stands sober, clear, and unified. Let's return once more to the image we opened with. The morning after, we said every drunk wakes up eventually, but not always on their own. Sometimes the waking is forced. The siege did not simply pass through Jerusalem and leave the wine untouched. The siege was the thing that broke it. 2 chapters ago, we watched a dragon at the gate, coiled just outside the walls. 1 chapter ago, we watched the wine inside those same walls, a nation drunk on a covenant it mistook for peace. Here, in chapter 29, both come to a head. The dragon presses in from 7 directions at once. The wine, finally, fully wears off. The pain along the way was not abstract. It is measured in real lives, the best of a generation, and the muffled whispers of those who spoke from beneath the dust. That cost does not vanish because the chapter ends in hope. It is part of what the hope had to pass through. And Zion wakes up sober, not triumphant in the way the world measures triumph, not finished, but awake, clear-eyed, standing on the tried stone, no longer ashamed of the face it sees in the mirror. The chapter ends with Israel on top. The word of our God stands forever.